Washington Journal continues.
Colonel Cedric Leighton is a former military intelligence officer with the U.S. Air Force and former deputy director of the National Security Agency, and is here to talk to us about the reported use of chemical weapons in Syria. Good morning and welcome to the program, sir.
Thank you, Rob. Good morning.
In the Washington Post this morning, they've got the headline, Obama seeks strong proof of sarin use. The president is seeking time before deciding whether Syria's probable use of chemical weapons will force the United States off the sidelines of a 2-year conflict that he has never seen as a central national security threat. Mm-hmm. With your experience as the former Deputy Director of National Security, what kind of proof would the President be looking for?
Well, what he's looking for, Rob, is a whole series of indicators. The difficulty that someone with the President's training has, he's a lawyer by training, you want the type of proof that can work in a court of law. And in the case of intelligence information, sometimes you get pretty good proof and sometimes you get lousy proof. There's very seldom do you have a chance to have complete, unequivocal, 100% ironclad proof. And that is one of the problems that intelligence deals with. And no matter how good it is from a technical standpoint or how good our sources are, there's always a question of doubt. And that makes decisions for policymakers and for leaders like the president very, very difficult, because if they're used to 100% certitude, there is no such thing. And that becomes a real problem from that standpoint. So he's looking for specific indicators, physiological proof, indicators that, in human tissue, in soil samples, things like that sarin was actually used. Sarin is a nerve agent, and it acts very quickly on the human body. The problem with sarin is that it also has a shelf life, in some cases a very short shelf life. And because of that short shelf life, sometimes the indicators disappear as you're analyzing, for example, a soil sample or even a human tissue sample. So that's the problem with getting incontrovertible proof. Sometimes that proof also has to take the form of the types of information that were passed within the chain of command, say, of the Syrian army. So if there's access to that kind of information, then it becomes more a matter of tying the different knots together and having fragmentary evidence that can then be pieced together in a mosaic of sorts that then gives you an idea of exactly what's out there.
The article in the Post goes on to say that the White House followed allies Britain, France, and Israel in concluding that chemical weapons were probably used by the Syrian regime over the past 4 months, but it added the caveat that the assessment was reached, quote, with varying degrees of confidence, unquote. What does that phrase mean, varying degrees of confidence?
It's a bureaucratic way of saying we're not quite sure. And so what that means is, in this particular case, you have different agencies who use different types of intelligence to get to draw their conclusions, to get to the conclusions that they believe are correct for any particular problem set. So in this particular case, for example, you could have the people that do imagery intelligence. They see a picture, they see pictures of things being moved that could possibly be precursors to the implementation of the use of sarin gas. You have physiological evidence, perhaps. You have soil samples. You may have traffic between various elements of the command structure. So you put all of that information together, and some parts of it are more conclusive than others, and that then creates the issue that you have, whether or not you have a complete agreement or a disagreement among the agencies. So some of the agencies are saying we believe that sarin has been used. Others are not quite sure. None of them, to my knowledge, has discounted the possibility of sarin gas use in the case of the Syrian situation. So that's where we're at this point.
Key lawmakers this week said that, quote, the red line in Syria has been crossed, calling for U.S. and international intervention after U.S. intelligence officials confirmed that small-scale chemical weapons were used in Syria. We're going to discuss this with Colonel Cedric Leighton, U.S. Air Force retired, and we'd like for you to get involved in the conversation. The numbers are up on the screen, and our first call comes from Auburndale, Florida. On our line for Democrats, Sherry, you're on the Washington Journal. Go ahead.
Yes, good morning.
Good morning.
I was just calling because, our country is in turmoil. There's a lot of things that are going on over here. Just for instance, just recently, the pressure cooker bombers. Whether we're talking about weapons of mass destruction with chemicals or some rigged up pressure cooker that is, destroying people here in our own country. We are so big on worrying about other countries with problems that they have. My mother used to say, sweep up from your own doorstep before you start dealing with other people's homes and doorsteps. That's just my thought this morning.
Sure, well, definitely, Sherry, I appreciate that sentiment. The issue here, though, is this. A lot of, if you note what happened in Boston, you look at the different types of people that were involved in that, the two brothers, the Tsarnaev brothers, they clearly had some degree of influence from their overseas experiences. And those overseas experiences tend to color the way they looked at the world. And they, in fact, I think in this case you can say they basically drove them to do what they did. So there is no separation between what happens overseas and what happens domestically. So we have to be at least cognizant. Doesn't mean we get involved in every single thing that's out there, but we have to understand what's going on, and in some cases it becomes necessary in the national interest to go ahead and get involved to prevent, for example, the slaughter of thousands of people. In the case of Syria, you have over 70,000 people, according to most estimates, that have been killed in the Syrian civil war. So then you have to make a decision as a policymaker. Is this in the national interest? Is this something where I come in and I actually say something or do something? And that becomes a key component of how you actually respond to a crisis like that. And it's a tough decision. Anybody who's in a policy-making role or decision-making role realizes that it's a very, very tough decision.
We're talking about the reported use of chemical weapons in Syria. Next call comes from Al in Castleton on the Hudson in New York on our line for Independence. Go ahead, Al.
Good morning, C-SPAN. Good morning, Rob. I hate to use my 1 month phone call for this issue. However, here's my opinion on this whole thing. We don't know who, what, or where, anything that's going on inside that country. Okay? It's typical of the Middle East. We see pictures of little children on CNN, and they're suffering a lot. Yeah, well, I have a heart, and I feel bad for them. But, here's the thing. We cannot do all the heavy lifting. Why is not the United Nations getting involved? Why aren't the locals over there? You ask the Israelis what they think of this. They'll give you their real opinion because they're on the front line there. If we can't get disengaged in Afghanistan at $2.5 billion a week, why are we going to get involved over there? Other than to make sure that those chemical weapons are not coming here or to Europe. That's the only reason we should be getting involved. No boots on the ground, no fly zones. We've tried all that.
Al, we're going to leave it there. Sorry for cutting you off. And Colonel, before we get your answer, I want to add in this headline that was in this morning's Financial Times. Obama's warning to Syria on chemical weapons adds pressure on Moscow. So in responding to Al's call regarding international concerns, also tell us why Moscow is being put in this discussion as well.
Oh, that's a great point, Rob. First of all, when you look at getting the UN involved, as Al was talking about, the problem with the UN is that it doesn't act as a unified body. And what do I mean by that? There are exceptions, obviously, to that, but generally speaking, those countries that are trying to protect another country, so for example, in the case of Syria, you have both Russia and China, both of them Security Council members of the United Nations Security Council. They have veto power over everything that goes on in the UN in terms of resolutions and actual actions that the UN does. So when you have a situation like this, it becomes very difficult for the international community to react, because what they're dealing with is trying to get consensus among all of these nations. Now, you could make the argument that it is self-evident that because of the suffering that is going on in Syria, all nations should jump in and should put a stop to the internal fighting that's going on in Syria. That would be one argument. But to get to the idea of why the Russians are perhaps put into a corner, as the Financial Times headline indicated that Rob mentioned. The Russians are in a tenuous position in Syria because they've been a long-time ally of that country. They have a naval base in a small port there on the Mediterranean coast of Syria. For them, it's a strategic interest. There are other countries that also see the current regime in Syria as a bulwark against other powers. Iran is the key element there. The Iranians have one major Arab ally, and that is Syria, the Syrian government of Bashar al-Assad. And as a result of that, what they're dealing with here is a situation where they believe that if the Assad government, the Russians, if the Assad government falls, they will no longer have access to that military base on the Mediterranean. If that military base is no longer open to the Russians, then they have a difficult time projecting power beyond their national borders. And under President Putin, Russia's goals have clearly been to at least expand Russian power, if not expand it even further than has been the case since the fall of communism. So what they want to do is maintain what they had and go into a mode where they regain what they had during the communist period and perhaps even extend that further. So that's one part of the Russian strategic calculus here. The problem that they now have is because of the use of chemical weapons. Chemical weapons, the possible use of them, chemical weapons are prohibited by treaty, by international treaty. And if the Russians come out and say, okay, we support the Assad regime in spite of the use of chemical weapons, that becomes a problem diplomatically for them, because then it weakens their position when it comes to the stymieing of chemical weapons use. So you've got a situation where you have the Russians trying to keep the Assad regime alive, but they do not approve of the Russian use of chemical weapons, the Syrian use of chemical weapons, excuse me. And so as a result of that, what they're trying to do is they're trying to play both sides. They want to keep Assad in power. They want to make it possible for the Assad regime to survive, or at least to exit gracefully, and to keep their port that they have access to right now in Syria. And that is really where they're going. And in terms of the use of chemical weapons, internationally, that becomes an untenable position for them to hold. It becomes very difficult for them to veto any other efforts against the Syrians that the UN may be considering.
We've got a tweet from Gary who writes, "Who cares if Syrians are killing each other? No sweat off our nose. Time for the U.S. not to get involved in any more foreign entanglements." Our next call for Colonel Cedric Leighton comes from Feasterville, Trevose, Pennsylvania, on our line for Democrats. John, you're on the Washington Journal.
Yes, good morning. Thanks for C-SPAN. Good morning, Rob.
Good morning, John. Go ahead.
I hope you give me a chance here. Yes, you got to establish a couple of basic facts here. First of all, Syria is not a threat to the United States. This is the first step. This would be a first step in a war with Syria. War in Syria, but we don't even we would be opposing Assad and the current government. The fact of the matter is, the jihadists are. We're aiding the jihadists, the same people, the Boston bombers. These are the people that are opposing the most powerful part of the opposition to Assad. The fact of the matter is, the ultimate objective here is Iran. Iran is not a threat to the United States. They don't have a nuclear weapon. We have 5,000. We have delivery systems of every nature. The Israelis are not threatened. They have 100 or more nuclear weapons. What's been overlooked here is that these wars in the Middle East have been an unmitigated disaster for the United States. We've spent trillions and will be spending trillions in the future for war, veterans' disability, veterans' pensions, disability, replacing the military equipment. These are a disaster for us. Another factor that's not considered is the minorities in Syria support the government. There's 2 million Christians in Syria.
John's sentiments are also reflected in this tweet from Jan Harris, who writes, "The American people will not stand for another Middle Eastern war." Colonel Leighton, your thoughts?
Well, I think there's some interesting thoughts here, both from John and Jan. First of all, you mentioned, John mentioned specifically that Syria and Iran were not threats to the U.S. The Syrian government is certainly not in a position to directly attack Washington, for example, or something like that. That's clearly true. However, when you look at the types of groups that Syria supports, they are clear supporters of Hezbollah, the main guerrilla organization that is active in Lebanon as Syrian proxy, and of course is a key antagonist of Israel. So the Israelis see the Syrians and Hezbollah, their proxies, as a key threat to their existence. We are tied by an alliance to the Israelis. Iran, as to Iran being a threat to the United States, you have to look at several different aspects of this. Is Iran going to mount a conventional attack against the United States mainland? No, it's not. It cannot do that. However, it is trying to achieve a nuclear capability. It is very clear from a lot of the evidence that is out there that, perhaps they do not have the bomb yet, but all of the facilities that they're building, the tests that they are conducting, the type of education that they give their people in engineering skills and certain engineering skills clearly leads down the path of nuclear preparedness in a weapons sense. Not nuclear power, but nuclear weapons. So you have that. You also have Iran affecting the interests of other U.S. allies, for example, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and Iraq. The Iranians were very concerned with the U.S. efforts in Operation Iraqi Freedom, the Iraq War. And many of the IEDs, the improvised explosive devices that were implanted in Iraq during the period from 2003 until our exit from Iraq, were actually the work of the Iranians. They worked very carefully with their intelligence services and the proxies that they had within Iraq to not only deploy, but also to detonate a lot of IEDs that were used against U.S. servicemen. So the Iranians are basically fighting what is known as asymmetric warfare against the United States. It is not a hot war, but it is a war that takes its toll little by little, incrementally, across a whole spectrum of events. And that is why the Iranian situation and the Iranian connection to Syria is a key reason why the Syrian situation is in our strategic interest to work through, to solve in concert with other nations, and to be very careful how we proceed. Now, it is true, one of the things that John mentioned is very true, that many of the folks that we would be supporting potentially in the Free Syrian Army in Syria are actually jihadists or associated with al-Qaeda in various ways. And that, of course, is a very dangerous situation, and it points to the sheer complexity of the situation in the Middle East and the difficulties of getting involved in a place that creates a lot of problems, not only for the people that live there, but people that are coming in to try to work the power situation from a nation-state perspective.
Colonel Leighton, we've got a tweet here from Jack Hutton, who wants to know, what does it mean if the use of chemical weapons is small and limited? And he also wants to know, are we certain Assad's responsible?
We are not certain, to my knowledge, that Assad is responsible for the use of the alleged use of sarin gas in Syria. There were two places where it is alleged to have been used, one near Damascus and the other near Aleppo, the largest city in Syria. So in this particular case, we are not specifically certain that Assad directed this. However, as far as we know, control of sarin gas is only within the hands of Syrian government forces. As far as we know, they are a centralized control type military where there is a very limited decentralized execution. The orders come from on high, and that means that basically the lowest echelon will take orders directly from the top through many layers of bureaucracy, and that's generally what's meant by that. So the indications bureaucratically, from an intelligence perspective and others, are that in this particular case, the most likely culprit would be the Syrian government. Now, as far as the limited use, what does that actually mean? It means that it wasn't quite frankly, very effective. It was used, apparently about 15 people died as a result of the dispensing of sarin gas, the use of sarin gas in these two incidents. That is, you know, as tragic as it is for those people, a relatively low death toll compared to what could happen with sarin gas. So it points to several different things. One of them could be that the sarin stockpiles in Syria are so old that they have in essence lost a large portion of their shelf life, of their effectiveness. And because of that, they may not be as effective as what they originally intended to be or made to be. So that is, in one sense, the way in which this kind of situation is a limited use of chemical weapons. And now the decision must be made. Do we go in based on a very limited use of chemical weapons, or are we waiting for a World War I style scenario where thousands of people potentially die? Now, in World War I, of course, it was trench warfare and civilian effects were fairly limited, but still massive effects, huge health implications for those that were affected. And if that's used against civilians like it was in Iraq by Saddam Hussein, that could be a big change in the way we look at these things.
We're talking about the use of chemical weapons in Syria. Our guest is Colonel Cedric Leighton, former military intelligence officer in the U.S. Air Force and former deputy director of the National Security Agency, currently founder and president of Cedric Leighton Associates, a Washington, D.C. strategic risk management consultancy.